Methodism and the Second World War. A talk for the 75th anniversary of VE Day, 8th of May 2020. Hello and welcome. This is certainly not the format that I intended when I suggested to our minister, Reverend Jill Hume, that I present a talk on Methodism and the Second World War to commemorate VE Day. The idea was to present a talk to ask those who attended to make a donation towards the church building project. Rather than completely abandon or postpone the idea, a talk to commemorate the 76th anniversary of VE Day doesn't quite have the same ring to it. It seemed a good idea to present it in this way. As some of you will be aware, I'm studying for a PhD in theology through Durham University on Methodist mission to the British Armed Forces. The story begins, as everything in Methodism begins, with John Wesley, writing to British soldiers fighting in Flanders during the 1740s. The Second World War has been the focus for my more recent research. It's a story that's not been told enough. This year, we've been focusing on our story, both individually and as a church. The story of Methodism and the Second World War is an important one that deserves wider circulation than in the pages of my thesis. Methodist Union, finally achieved in 1932, brought together the Wesleyans, Primitives and United Methodists. Union, or reunion, did not bring consensus over the most important issues that faced the nation during the 1930s, peace and war. It's remarkable that the church managed to accommodate pacifists and those who believed that war was sometimes justified, both during the period leading up to the Second World War and during the war itself. During the 1930s, Methodism, like much of the rest of Britain, strongly supported the peace movement. It was, by some margin, the biggest popular movement of the decade. A repetition of the horrors of the First World War had to be avoided at all costs, and the potential for mass bombing of civilian populations made the prospect of another conflict even worse. Some of the denomination's best-known figures, such as Donald Soper, took prominent roles in the pacifist movement and helped to establish the Methodist Peace Fellowship. Leading Methodists lobbied in favour of the 1934 peace ballot, in which nearly 12 million Britons expressed support for disarmament, international cooperation and the League of Nations. Several peace organisations of the 1930s enjoyed strong Methodist support. By 1938, the Methodist Peace Fellowship had the support of nearly 800 ministers and 3,000 lay members. Very influential though they were, pacifists were always a minority within Methodism. During the 1930s, when the peace movement was so prominent within the church, Methodism continued to support its ministry to Britain's armed forces. The Wesleyans had provided ministry to soldiers, both at home bases and on campaign, since the 1860s. The First World War had seen all three major Methodist churches providing commissioned chaplaincy for the armed forces. Unity within Methodism saw this mission to the members of the forces thrive. In both the Army and the Air Force, but not the Royal Navy, Methodism was achieving near equality of status with the established churches. Methodists no longer had to struggle for recognition. They'd become part of the religious establishment in providing ministry to the men and women of the Army and the RAF. From 1937, the evident threat posed by Hitler and the barbarity of Nazi Germany led many to question unconditional pacifism. By 1938 and 1939, most Methodists shared broader public opinion that war was inevitable if German aggression was to be resisted and civilization saved. The Methodist Recorder questioned Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement, giving in to Hitler. The Munich Agreement, though joyfully greeted by most churches, caused misgivings. Leslie Weatherhead asked his City Temple congregation, "Do you feel, just a little, as though you just made friends with a burglar?" The defeat of Republican Spain, the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, and the British guarantee to Poland during the same month proved tipping points in Methodist opinion. Leslie Weatherhead, previously almost a pacifist, spoke for many Methodists. He believed that European situation in 1939 required of him, and all Christians, deeper thinking than simply rejecting war. His views were changed by the self-evident evils of Nazism and a firm conviction that the British government had done everything possible to avoid war. Weatherhead believed the government had to be supported in resisting Hitler by the use of reasonable force. The atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis justified taking up arms. And if war be, at our present stage, the only way of delivering people from such outrages, would Christ not bid us to make resistance? The outbreak of war saw most Methodists support what they believed was a just conflict against an evil and aggressive state. Richard Pike, President of Conference, announced in a message to the Methodist people, published in the Methodist Recorder, that this was a just conflict. If ever there was a war where only a desire to resist aggression and to save freedom for the world were the reasons for which it was waged, it is this war. There was no tub thumping, as there had been a generation earlier. This was not portrayed as a crusade, unlike the way in which the previous war had been presented, but, rather, a necessary struggle for Christian civilization. The outbreak of the war, though, saw sharp rifts in Methodism. The war could not be justified from Christian belief, argued Donald Soper. I am alone sustained by the Christian faith, which assures me that what is morally right carries with it the ultimate resources of the universe. Membership of the Methodist Peace Fellowship, the largest of the denominational peace organisations, grew during the first 2 years of the war. By the middle of 1941, there were 5,000 members, including 845 ministers, although support declined sharply thereafter. Conscription caused further divisions in Methodism, as it had done during the previous conflict. The beliefs of some Methodists would not allow them to join the armed forces. They became conscientious objectors. Most were prepared to do other forms of national service, such as agriculture or forestry, or they joined elements of the forces which would not require them to fight, such as the Royal Army Medical Corps. A small minority, however, were absolute objectors, refusing any form of service. In southwest England, Methodists made up 15% of all those who were conscientious objectors on religious grounds, more than any other denomination. Even in Methodism, however, conscientious objectors were massively outnumbered by those who served in the armed forces, either as volunteers or conscripts. Most Methodists believed the war was irreproachably justified. Scott Liggett spoke for the majority in the church when he wrote, "Never did a nation take up arms in a more momentous cause than in the present case. If the will of Germany prevails, then all the accepted spiritual values of the Christian faith will be persistently outraged throughout Europe and beyond." The Methodist Church managed these deep differences well, maintaining both individual liberty of conscience and support for the state, whilst keeping both sides within the fold. With extensive German bombing of British cities, civilians were in the front line. 2,067 Methodist buildings were destroyed or damaged by enemy action. The basement of Westminster Methodist Central Hall was turned into an air raid shelter. Its superintendent minister, W.E. Sangster, arranged a wide range of activities and diversions for those who sought its sanctuary. This ministry was primarily social rather than specifically spiritual. Service before services made clear his priorities. Nearly 500,000 people spent at least one night during Central Hall during the war. On the outbreak of the war, there were 23 Methodist chaplains holding commissions in the armed forces, 9 in each of the Army and the RAF, and 5 in the Navy. There were, in addition, ministers in the Reserve and Territorial Forces and over 300 officiating chaplains, civilian ministers who met the needs of service personnel. These numbers grew rapidly. Unlike the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches, the Methodist Church was able to fill all the chaplaincy vacancies allocated to it. so much so that Methodists in the Army and the Air Force were better represented by clergymen of their denomination than those followers of other churches. A total of 430 Methodist chaplains were commissioned during the Second World War, 6 of whom, 5 serving with the Army and 1 with the RAF, were killed on active service. The church's chaplains served in all 3 services, in all theatres of war, many of them with considerable distinction. Much chaplaincy overseas was undertaken during highly mobile campaigns. The itinerant Methodist preacher, familiar during Wesley's lifetime, reappeared during the Second World War. Reverend Harold Key served in France in 1940 with the Light Anti-Aircraft and Light Anti-Tank Regiment. He recalled his ministry during the rapid retreat under fire of part of his unit through Normandy and Brittany to Brest from where they were evacuated, a time of deliverance according to his description. I am proud Methodism has a place in the Army, and that her young circuit ministers so largely fill that place. To serve our boys in the heroic struggle for God's kingdom and freedom and family is the greatest privilege that will ever come to us. The war in North Africa was fought across huge distances. Reverend John Williams ran a mobile canteen and ministry which travelled between isolated units in North Africa, covering 1,500 miles from El Alamein in Egypt to Sfax in Tunisia. Men appeared equally grateful for the opportunity to worship as they were for the refreshments and toiletries distributed. Reverend Richard Mort was killed in Tobruk in June 1942. In an article entitled A Challenge from the Middle East, published posthumously, he described his chaplaincy in the desert. Mort had been all too aware of the significance of the lands in which services had been held. They had worshipped in ground made sacred by Jesus, by St. Paul, by Elijah, by Moses, and by Abraham. He had led men to sing the songs of Zion in a strange land. In the previous year, he'd held only 1 service in a consecrated building, and only 3 services in any sort of building, huts. The rest of the time he preached to congregations varying from 2 to 500 in fields, orange groves, vineyards, vehicle pits, slit trenches, tents, dugouts, and once in a cave. For a communion table, he'd use oil drums, sandbags, water carriers, even a box of canned beer. He concluded, Methodism can be proud of her sons in the lines, for they know you need not to be vulgar to be tough. Methodist men, to use that descriptive Americanism, can take it. Reverend Ernest Smoky Funnell was also killed in March 1942 during the retreat from Burma. In his obituary, published in the Times, the troops with whom he served, rough, hard soldiers who deeply mourn his loss, he was their pal, described his big-heartedness, his cheerful disposition, and not least his saintly influence. Chaplains of all denominations tended the injured in battle and met their needs when they were evacuated to hospital. Reverend John Humphrey's first experience of chaplaincy in a combat area was when he landed with a hospital unit in Normandy shortly after D-Day. Humphreys admitted to being unsure of what was expected of him. He asked himself what a patient would demand of a padre, concluding that the men needed 2 things: a friendly disposition, engaging in conversation about home and family, and that the chaplain should present a benign providence which cares about human beings who suffer. Men did not want pious talk, but rather firm conviction expressed by implication rather than direct reference. An important function of the chaplain was the burial of the dead. Wilfred Hill was adamant about the importance of burying everybody as soon as feasible, that every burial must be as decent as possible, and that the chaplain should tackle the worst of it himself. He wrote, I believe this to be of great practical importance. I am quite sure it has an important bearing on morale. His notebooks from Sicily and Anzio describe the exact location of all burials. including those of Italians and Germans, with detailed maps, diagrams and directions. The names, units, next of kin, and denominations of the dead are recorded. Interestingly, not one of the many British casualties that he buried is recorded as being that of a Methodist. It's clear from his burial books that he wrote to the relatives of all of those that he buried. His papers at the Imperial War Museum contain 16 letters from bereaved relatives thanking Padre Hill for writing to them. Hill was awarded the Military Cross for actions at Sicily and Anzio. The citation attests to his courage. On occasions too numerous to mention, he has gone out under fire to the aid of wounded men, never distinguishing between one unit and another, between friend or foe. Whenever conditions have been difficult, this officer has always been up at the front, cheerful and encouraging. He has had a great effect in maintaining the morale of our troops, whilst his constant indifference to his personal safety has been an example to all. Leslie Skinner was one of several Methodist chaplains who showed quite extraordinary bravery and selflessness. He was believed to have been the first British chaplain ashore on the morning of D-Day. Like Wilfred Hill, he sought out the remains of the dead and ensured they had Christian burials, often at considerable personal risk to himself. He frequently removed bodies, buried men, and conducted funerals whilst under fire. On the 10th of June, he recorded occasional rifle fire while digging graves. David Render, an officer who served with him in the Sherwood Rangers, wrote, "Our Padre put the spiritual needs of our dead soldiers above any army red tape, and he was severely rebuked by the military chaplain's chain of command." On the 25th of June, while he was bringing in a wounded soldier, Skinner was hit in the head by shrapnel from a mortar shell, knocked unconscious and evacuated back to England for treatment. Hospital chaplain John Chaplins met Leslie Skinner, fellow Methodist chaplain, as a casualty. Skinner was, he wrote, incensed at being evacuated back to Britain, leaving the men to whom he was assigned. He has the right spirit, but which seeks to serve the men. He was helping to carry a stretcher when a mortar splinter got him. I'm glad he's a Methodist parson. Padre Skinner discharged himself from a military hospital in England in order to rejoin the men to whom he ministered in Normandy, and he served with them throughout the rest of the war. Leslie Skinner's muscular Christianity, his service and courage resulted in him being mentioned in dispatches and the awards of the French Croix de Guerre with Palm and the Belgian Chevalier of the Order of Leopold II with Palm. The citation for the latter read, "During the operations which terminated in the liberation of Belgium, and since, he was always to be found with the most advanced troops, subjecting himself to very considerable danger. So far forward did this gallant officer go that he was almost always at the side of the wounded and dying men on the battlefield. It's difficult to praise too highly the conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty of Captain Skinner." Methodism's first parachute chaplain, Reverend Robert Talbot Watkins, was one of the first two chaplains to undertake training with airborne troops. Watkins served at Arnhem, accompanying the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment during the first landing on the 17th September 1944. He administered first aid and gathered and tended the wounded. These were typical of chaplains in the field. His role at Arnhem, however, went far beyond that expected of a chaplain. Being the most senior officer in rank during the confusion that arose during German attacks on the 19th September, he took control of a group of men and gave them orders. He undertook reconnaissance of the battlefield, recovered and organised scattered groups of men from several units. He organised the evacuation of walking wounded, bringing them safely across the river by boat, and then returned to help more men to escape. Watkins was only one of 3 from the 15 chaplains who landed who was not killed or taken prisoner. For his bravery and service at Arnhem, he was awarded the Military Cross. The experience of Methodist military chaplains was that it was impossible isolate the religious and social elements of their ministry. In an article in the Methodist Recorder, Padre Robert Kerr described the work that the church was doing with service personnel in Bombay. Ministry in the city included vibrant and well-attended services, and the activities of Wesley House, which offered hospitality and entertainment to the large number of soldiers, sailors, and airmen who were in transit through the city. On offer were the Sunday social hour, cinema shows, lectures, missionary talks, and free refreshments. This ministry appeared largely social. However, Kerr made no apology for this. Possibly, some who may read what I'm saying will criticise this work as being too largely social service in character. But I should like myself to be told where in such work for Christ social service ends and spiritual service begins. Other Methodist chaplains to the armed forces shared Kerr's views. Their responsibility was for the well-being of the men and the women that they served. There were no barriers between their spiritual and pastoral roles. Chaplains in the RAF, unlike the Army, did not accompany service personnel into action. Methodist ministers served at air bases at home and overseas, and also toured the country, caring for small isolated units such as those operating barrage balloons. An RAF chaplain had to be, according to Reverend Arthur Hitchens, as St. Paul, all things to all men. He was posted to a bomber station at Congsby in Lincolnshire. His first priority had been to get to know the men through asking about their families and sweethearts. He also used his ability to play the piano to good effect for sing-songs. In a similar fashion to army chaplains, Hitchin visited the sick and injured in hospital, led Sunday morning parade services and Sunday evening and midweek voluntary services. He was a regular presence in the crew room for an operation. In an article with the subtitle Broken Threads, he described trying to console the wives and parents of the many aircrew who were killed in raids on occupied territories. In addition to all the letters that he'd written, I have talked with many heartbroken widows whose young husbands have been killed in action. Reverend C. Aidan Fisk was the chaplain to a bomber unit in North Africa during 1943. He described the ministry of an unusual church in the desert. A communion table fashioned from aeroplane fabric stretched on a wooden frame, a communion rail made of wood from a German lorry, shell cases as flower vases, a communion rail, bomb boxes as seats, and a harmonium, which was a find. Fisk was the only chaplain attached to this RAF unit, which necessitated ecumenical ministry, including Bible study, a TOC H group, choir practice, and discussion groups. The church council was comprised of Anglicans, Congregationalists, and Methodists. Chaplaincy in the Royal Navy was dominated by the Church of England. Although there were a small number of Methodist chaplains at ports, they did not accompany crews to sea. Anglican chaplains used the administering of communion as the reason for excluding ministers of other denominations. Free church members could receive the Eucharist from a C of E padre, but not the other way round. Ships did not have the accommodation to allow chaplains from more than one church to go to sea. That church was the Church of England. Douglas Spear, one of the few Methodist chaplains who served in the Navy throughout the war, described this exclusion as being in, yet not of, the Royal Navy. Only after coordinated and extensive lobbying by the Church of Scotland and the Free Churches were their chaplains allowed to serve on ships at sea during the last 18 months of the war. The ministry that Methodism offered to servicemen and women extended beyond commissioned chaplaincy. Throughout Britain and the Empire, churches and their members offered spiritual and practical hospitality to members of the armed forces. Civilian ministers readily volunteered for the role of officiating clergymen. Some 1,060 Methodist ministers served as officiating chaplains to the forces. Civilian ministers working part-time with the forces based at home. A disproportionately high number compared to most other churches. It was not only ministers who volunteered their services. Halls and schoolrooms were open for the use of service personnel. Women of the church knitted and sewed copiously, wrote letters, collected and dispatched parcels of games, writing paper and comforts to the troops. Peter Hornibrook and Margaret Sangster, who coordinated these efforts, were proud of these endeavours. So far as we can hear, there is no church that has done what we've done for the lads. We want the boys to continue to feel that their church not only prays for them, but works for them too. The Methodist Recorder reported in July 1940 on Methodism's splendid war effort. The women of Methodism have been simply magnificent. At Christmas 1940, civilians were urged by the Methodist Recorder to offer hospitality to servicemen. Christmas dinner with families, suppers, teas, concerts and games. Reverend P. Middleton Bromwell, Methodist Deputy Chaplain General, wrote that this fellowship was paramount. Men do not want sermons and prayer meetings as a first introduction. Comradeship is the badge of their tribe. The Times of the 20th of January 1942 reported on Methodist war effort, commissioned chaplains, officiating chaplains to the forces, canteens, soldiers and sailors' homes, and goods distributed. By the middle of 1944, some 600 canteens had been opened, and 39 tons of knitted goods and 14 tons of books and games had been distributed. Although all churches ran canteens and collected comforts for the armed forces, Methodists, with their traditions of social responsibility, were able to mobilise practical and spiritual resources considerably in excess of their numbers. The Church did not differentiate between the practical and spiritual needs of members of the forces. Methodist civilians provided spiritual and practical hospitality to servicemen and women serving away from home. Whilst in training as an electrical technician in the Royal Signals at Catterick Camp during 1943, Dennis Newland regularly attended a local Methodist chapel whose members made him most welcome, as he described. They liked to get soldiers involved in small duties, like being a server. People were very kind and hospitable to soldiers in these places. No doubt many of them had their own sons in faraway places. David Warren was one of those Methodist soldiers who benefited from ministry and fellowship in such faraway places. Whilst in Durban, South Africa, en route in 1942 to the Middle East with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, he and a friend worshipped in the Methodist Church and took advantage of the free canteen at Wesley Hall. There were Wesley halls and houses at several overseas postings. Edgar Ford, a Methodist Lance Corporal, described the work of Wesley House in Cairo. Men from several nations used the facilities for letter writing, reading, games, rest and refreshment in a distinctly Methodist environment. Fellowship meetings, hymn singing, and local preachers' classes were regular occurrence. Ford wrote, Wesley would have been proud to bestow his name on a work such as this. Within a few days of liberation, Wesley houses were established in cities such as Naples, Florence and Rome in Italy, and Brussels and Antwerp in Belgium. The facility in Antwerp was the former headquarters of the Gestapo in the city and was, according to gunner R.F. Smith, a haven of rest for the spirit, mind and body for war-weary Methodists. In his presidential address for the 1945 conference in Nottingham, Archibald Harrison paid tribute to the contribution of the Church to members of the forces. Methodism's war work has been widespread and varied. In town and country, there has been a continuous effort to provide amenities and hospitality for service personnel. This effort has never been allowed to slacken. All over the world, there are men and women with happy memories of the canteen on Methodist premises and the friendship shown in Methodist homes. Reverend Harrison had due cause to take pride in Methodism's war effort. Its work was even more credible creditable when viewed in the context of the huge damage to Methodist premises, particularly in large centres of population, sustained. Whilst accommodating a significant pacifist minority, the Church had been highly effective in its wartime ministry to the armed forces. Chaplaincy had met all the demands made of it. Sufficient and suitable ministers were recruited to serve effectively in all three services and in all theatres. Their church could be proud of their service. The world is my parish meant there were no defining boundaries to mission. Chaplaincy was to all. Ministry was offered to Methodist servicemen and women, Christians of other denominations, and to those with little or no faith background. There were no artificial divisions between spiritual and temporal ministry, either in commissioned chaplaincy or in civilian ministry. The Church saw its role as to meet the needs of all members of the armed forces, religious and practical. In both Britain and overseas, the Church and its members showed quite extraordinary commitment to its Christian witness to the Army, Navy and Air Force. The role that Methodism played in Britain during the Second World War is a story that deserves to be told and heard.